Hey, Jonathan. Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this presentation. My name is Jay Shutter. I'm CEO of Illuminas, and I've got a lot of data to go through. I'm going to do my best to walk you through each slide at a time. There is a lot of data on each slide, so I won't be able to talk to all the different points, but I'll do my best to cover them. And of course, anything that comes up in terms of a question, we can address that later. So just very quickly, to remind everybody what the overall study was, again, you saw that it was fielded in October of November last year. So it's, things are changing, but maybe not so fast that we'll see so many differences between now and when we fielded the study. This was 600 in total survey responses across the US, UK, and English-speaking APAC, ANZ, Hong Kong, Singapore, right? So we try to keep this simple and focused on English-speaking from a methodology standpoint. And, we covered a lot of territory. Are we modernizing the applications? What does that look like? What is a priority? What does that landscape look like? How are they going about modernization? And what would a successful migration look like? This was a 25-minute survey done over the phone. And we had respondents who were sourced from third-party databases, so a broad representation of businesses out there. And that's the thing that we need to keep in mind. There's lots of differences in companies, and we can find really advanced, very forward organizations. This really represents a broader set, but I'll give you some caveats on that once we start looking at the details a little bit more. This was a survey among IT decision makers, backend developers, and software architects. And you can see that ratio over here on the right-hand side of the screen. So ITDMs represented about 51% backend dev, 25% software architects, 25%. They had to be influencers. We wanted them to be the individuals who are actually making recommendations about the platforms and tools that they were using. So they had to not only be those recommenders or influencers, but they had to have obviously involvement and insight into what was going on inside their organizations. Now, these companies, they had to have an internal app development team. Now, there are a lot of organizations that develop applications. They do it all outsourced, right? But we wanted to make sure we were talking to organizations that had app dev teams internally. And they had to be already have applications that they are currently modernized or were planning to modernize. So that was a real requirement. So that kind of differentiates them a little bit. They're a little bit more forward on that journey towards app modernization. They also had to be building new infrastructure or modern IT services. Again, this makes them a little bit different than the broader set of businesses out there, but not really that hardcore, high-tech, advanced type of organization. But even more so, obviously, for the community, right? We wanted to make sure that they're either using hybrid cloud or multi-cloud, and that they're using containers or Kubernetes, right? So we wanted to make sure that they're a little bit further down that path so we can get a sense of what these organizations are doing. Now, the representation from industries, the top industries that we ended up with were wholesale, retail, trade, finance, CSD, and ISVs. Of course, you're going to have some of these development shops, telcos, energy, and utilities. And then that's split between medium and large. Nice representation there. And here's where we're going to see platforms working well together, PowerPoint and everything else. So up in the left-hand corner, let's quickly look at the profile of these companies. They weren't all doing multi-cloud. I think we all like to think that businesses are doing lots of multi-cloud. They really aren't. A lot of them go to AWS, for example, and that's where they stay, or they're on Azure, or they're on GCP, right? They don't all have multiple cloud instances, if you will. I know there are lots of organizations out there that do that, but not really when you look broadly. They really look at it and say, yeah, we're kind of just here, depending upon how you want to, qualify that, right? Does Azure and count separately from Microsoft 365 as an example? So how they view multi-cloud is very interesting. And a lot of them aren't suggesting that they want to have this big, broad spread of applications across multiple clouds. We know that's a lot more work when we do that. And that's where we get into that whole world of multi-cloud management tools and all those different things. So that's the kind of snapshot of this audience in terms of their multi-cloud usage. On the right-hand side, you can see, of course, by our requirements, that they are using hybrid cloud or plan to in the next couple of years. Hybrid cloud is also one of those definitional things, how they view it and what that really means. Some of them more sophisticated and truly having a hybrid scenario with back-end databases, for example, and a cloud front end up in public cloud as an example, versus some that may not be as sophisticated as that, but truly from their perspective, doing hybrid cloud. In that bottom left-hand corner, you can see the requirements based on how we screened people and that we wanted them to be modernizing existing infrastructure or delivering or building new infrastructure, right, to deliver modern IT services. We wanted to be talking to the organizations who are more likely to be using containers and Kubernetes. And of course, on the right-hand side, you can see that split. So a lot of them, by requirement, the way we did this, either using or planning to use containers or Kubernetes. All right, let's talk about quickly the key takeaways. We're going to get into all the data that will kind of feed back to this. Companies that are looking at app modernization, think of it in the context of containerizing workloads, automating and reducing operations, and bringing those workloads into the cloud. We gave them a list of items. They had to choose from them. We didn't have them type in an answer. So when we gave them that list, these are the things that stood out more predominantly than the other options. And again, you'll see that detail later. What they're trying to do with app modernization is they want to increase that scalability or reliability of their applications. Obviously, we know the advantages of cloud native and everything that we're doing in the cloud bring that nature to our applications' ability to scale and makes them more reliable, of course. But they're also trying to decrease costs and improve security along the way as well. So some of the key things driving app modernization. What prevents organizations from moving forward down that journey or going more quickly? Resistance to change. It's very difficult. As we all know, when we make changes, when we fix things that aren't broken, they break, right? So resistance to change, time constraints, budget constraints, they're all the typical things that we'd expect. And we know somewhere in there, there's probably skills gaps and other challenges along the way. So what does that path look like? What does that journey look like? What we see is that more companies expect to deploy applications through private cloud, whether that's on-prem, which seems to be what we mean when we say that, in our own data centers, right? Or in a public cloud, in a private, single tenant estate, for example. They want to go private. There's still this concern about being in public cloud to some extent for good reasons, right? And they expect a larger portion of their custom apps to be cloud enabled or cloud native. And anything that they're doing new, as we all know, is all going cloud native. No one's thinking about architecting in more traditional ways. Everything is moving modern cloud native if they're going net new. It's that question of how do we take existing custom legacy apps and modernize those. When we do look at that, what are they going to do? Are they going to re-platform? Are they going to refactor? Are they going to repurchase? And what we see is, more than half of these organizations that have legacy applications expect them to be re-platformed, refactored, or repurchased over the next 2 years. So they've got a short window that they're looking at. And they expect those efforts to be done as, when they're thinking about modernizing what they have, more than half of those applications modernized within the next year. So 2-year window, 1 year as fast as they can, about half of them. And what's the priority? It's those core backend applications, right? It makes sense where they need that to make sure things are modernized first. And that's the process that they go through as they look at this. Which apps do we modernize first, and what does that process look like? Which path do we choose? And what's really important here, it's done with a lot of partners. Partners play a big role, not only in helping them internally, but actually leading some of those charges. So external partners are going to play a big part in this modernization. The development teams themselves, they're using Python and HTML and CSS, obviously a lot. They're expecting an increased usage of JavaScript, Ruby, C#, Spring Boot. Look, there are a whole bunch of studies out there about what are the top application development tools, development environments, things like that. And it really just depends upon the audience that you talk to and what kind of businesses they are, what kind of applications they have, and where they're focused, right? From this audience, this is what we see. It's a very interesting read. And we'll take a look very closely at what they're using and what they think they're going to be using more in the next 2 years, right? What kind of workloads are they running? They're going to run mission critical things, of course, but they're using a lot of AI, ML, data caching tools, and HPC, and they're going to see that, they're seeing that grow over the next couple of years. But they're doing web servers, business apps, databases, analytics, things like that. Some of the traditional things we'd expect to see in business environments. I'm not going to go through all these in detail because there's an awful lot here. When we look at the detailed slides, we'll see the differences by country, by region. What we basically are saying here is there are some differences. There's some similarities and there's some differences. For example, what are the unique definitions in terms of how the US views app modernization versus, say, the UK or APAC? In the US, it was more about microservices architecture in the cloud than about something like improving the CI/CD pipeline, what we see from the UK or APAC, right? So some real interesting subtle differences by country. For example, the unique success measures decreased costs in the US is the focus, whereas in the UK, it's about increased customer sat, and similarly in the APAC, but also improved security, right? So there are these little differences by region. I think in general, we can see some of the trends, but for your benefit, these are some of those subtle differences. And we have another one when we look at the languages, runtime frameworks, et cetera, and workloads. It's not that they're not doing these other things, but these are the things that stood out as being a little bit different statistically or just directionally. So for example, we see the US more likely to be using SQL and .NET or R, which I thought was very interesting. C# or Java EE, right? Versus the UK tended to be more likely to use Python, PHP, JavaScript, Ruby. It's not that they're not using SQL or C# or R. These are the ones that were more strongly being used relative to the other regions. As you can see as well in APAC, it's Python, HTML, cascade silent sheets, and PHP, et cetera, right? So again, this nice list of subtle differences. When you look back over this, if you want to get this report, you can see these differences in more detail later on. All right, let's dive into the details. Makes it a lot easier to kind of see where some of these numbers are coming from. Let's talk about defining app modernization. On the left-hand side was the list of items that we said, hey, when you think of modernizing applications, what does that mean to you? And as you can see here at the top, when we look at the total in that gold column on the left, it was about containerizing workloads. That's really how they think about app modernization, or they're automating and reducing operations. They're bringing workloads into the cloud, improving CI/CD, and then using microservices architecture. When we look to the right, when we look at those differences from the US to the UK to the Asia-Pac countries, right? On those bars, you're going to see letters A, B, and C. That's a statistical reference, meaning when we look, for example, at containerizing workloads, you can see an A underneath the UK column. That basically means that it's statistically significant relative to the US. That's column A. Asia-Pac is even stronger at 78%, and that's statistically significant from the UK and the US. Thus, you see an A and a B. That's what those numbers mean. And that's where we really kind of see some of these meaningful differences from this audience in terms of how they're approaching app modernization. And this is why at the bottom, you can see the US was more likely, much more likely to say actually, in some sense, that app modernization is about microservices architecture. So they're at 41%, where the UK was 27%. And Asia-Pac was at 35%. So some really interesting perspectives on how we think about app modernization. You know, it's a great community that we live in, and everyone has different perspectives on these terms and these frameworks and things that we do. There is no one right answer, as I've learned over many years of doing this. It's really interesting to kind of get that perspective from the people who are down in the trenches themselves. All right, so what are the reasons that they're doing app modernization? It's about increasing scalability, increasing reliability, and decreasing costs, or improving security, where you can see that in the Asia-Pac countries, security was a much bigger driver of app modernization than, say, in the US and the UK. It's not that it was non-existent. Obviously, 55% in the US, 51 in the US, 55 in the UK, but 61% of the audience said that that was one of the top drivers. They had to pick 3 of these things, right, and rank them. And so that's how we get some of these perspectives on this. So really, it's about scalability, reliability, decreasing costs, and ultimately security. But you see those interesting perspectives, and I've seen this pretty consistently. It's not that the US isn't focused on customer satisfaction, because we know voice of customer is huge here in the US. Everything that we're doing around user experience, big here. But from this audience, for whatever reason, the UK and Asia-Pac seems to be much more focused on that customer experience perspective. And it could just be sort of that lag from region to region where, you know, we know customer experience UX has been a big deal in the US for a long time now. And it may just be important, but not as important as some of these other things. All right, the top barriers. It's always interesting to find out, what do we need to do as practitioners? What do we need to do as leaders in our organizations to make change happen, to drive this app modernization more seamlessly, more effectively? What are those barriers? Well, it's resistance to change. Bottom line, how do we convince not only our developers, but the IT teams, whoever we need to, about the direction that we're heading in terms of app modernization? The fact that we need to potentially refactor if we have to, or rehost if that's the best path, right? All of the things that we need to do, it's all about that communication and making sure that we break down that resistance to change. There's time constraints, there's budget constraints. When you look at a list like this, and even though, you know, we wanted them to just hopefully focus on one thing. The fact that we're around 32% all the way down means a lot of people are selecting a lot of these items. These are all barriers, some of them just stronger than others for different organizations. And what we found very interesting was in the US, determining the right approach was a real barrier to app modernization, right? And I've heard this in a lot of the focus group work that I do, where they simply say, look, we've got so many applications, legacy applications that have incredible amounts of integration. What is the right approach? Do we just lift and shift? Do we really want to take the time and budget and effort to potentially refactor or do anything else or do we just kind of just retain it as is and don't make any changes, right? It's a real challenge in some of these bigger organizations. What path do we take? And in some cases, they look at it and they say, we don't see the value in modernizing. Let's just retain it as is. So that's very interesting when we look at that relative to these other regions, where I think the US has a lot more embedded legacy infrastructure than we might see outside the US. All right, we have the barriers, and then we ask the question around what are the challenges while you're in the process? And what we find is that, it's very similar, right? It's about cost and budget. It's about resistance to change. You can see these little call-outs that we've got, is the developer group different from ITDM versus the architects, right? Developers seem to feel like there's greater resistance to change, likely within the development teams themselves, as well as potentially with stakeholders in other places. But you can see that that was a slightly bigger deal in the US, say, than it was in Asia-Pac, the Asia-Pac region. Time constraints, all the things that we'd expect, very similar. And that's where that, I mentioned earlier, lack of skilled resources, it is a consideration. It is a challenge for some of these organizations. Or frankly, that last response, hey, we're pretty good. We haven't faced any challenges. I can imagine. All right, so what are they going to, did we move forward here? Yeah, how are we going to measure success? And these are those top measures of success. It relates to some of those challenges and barriers, right? We are going to look at, did we actually increase reliability? And I've heard this a lot, where that is really the simplest way for us to understand, have we made an impact? Have we made the right decision, right? Are we going to increase our reliability? And we can measure that. So it's very measurable. And you can see it's slightly higher in the US, say, than Asia-Pac, but it is the number one for sure globally. But increased scalability is also there, right? As the businesses are growing, as they're deploying more applications, as they're wanting to do more and more in the cloud, that scalability is really going to be critical, especially when we consider time to market. How can we scale quickly? And it's going to be through these modern app methods and architectures. And security, of course, is always there, much more of a factor from the folks that we spoke to in the Asia-Pac region. It's not that it's not important in the other regions, it just ended up being more important to these audiences. And you can see, again, that increased customer sat element coming from the Asia-Pac region. All right, so do we want to be in a multi-cloud environment and run on a whole bunch of different platforms, or do we want to be single platform? And I think this is where we're starting to see a lot more of the desire to be agnostic to the extent possible. Can we containerize? Can we run workloads in a way that we have greater flexibility of where we deploy them and don't have to feel locked in? And you can see here that the desire is really to have the majority of the applications running on multiple platforms once we're done modernizing, where we can make the best decision about the right infrastructure, the right cloud, public cloud to run them in, or our own data center for that matter. And among developers, they were much more likely to say, nah, we just want one platform. And you can imagine why. Right, because it's a lot of effort to make sure things effectively and successfully run on every platform. We know it's a promise. Everyone likes to say that it's going to run seamlessly and smoothly. We know that isn't always the reality, but so I can imagine that's why developers are a little less likely to say they wanted to do it on multiple platforms. All right, how are they going to approach this? What are their plans? How do we modernize? Let's start with the languages themselves, the runtimes and the frameworks. And again, this is this unique audience that we looked at. There are lots of other studies out there that might have these same frameworks and same runtime languages and things in different orders. Nonetheless, we can see the range here from what they're using today to what they think they're going to be using 2 years from now. So Python, we know that's a very popular language. It's used in a lot of different things, especially these days, obviously in analytics, AI, ML type applications. So Python is very popular. HTML is not going anywhere, neither is CSS. So we can see that that's still going to be a very predominant thing. but Java is still really out there strongly. SQL, PHP, JavaScript. So, these are the tools that this audience is using. This is very developer specific. This is very company specific. This is very application specific, obviously, right? This is very different, right? So your mileage may vary when you look at this relative to what your organization is doing, what you're doing as a developer. Now, the languages runtimes that they're using today by region, this is always interesting to see where these languages have caught hold differently. And to me, the fascinating thing is, where's Microsoft headquartered and where are we? We're a SQL country, it seems. So much stronger, so much more SQL here in the US being reported by these companies relative to the other regions. Where we see conversely that Python is actually stronger in the UK and Asia Pac area relative to the US, as is, if we want to look at it, JavaScript for that matter, which I find very interesting. Again, these country differences. I wouldn't say that this was 100%. Like, if you talk to every company, we were able to survey every company, we'd see these exact same ratios or trends. But amongst 600 interviews, it's a very interesting read to see these differences. And .NET even continues to reinforce the where's Microsoft headquartered country. It's in the US where we see .NET much stronger than it is in the UK and other regions, are much stronger here from what we're doing. And then Ruby, so lots of interesting variants here. And I don't know if there's a simple explanation. I just love to use the SQL and .NET one to kind of point out some of the things that we see uniquely in the US. Now, tomorrow by region, where's the growth happening? And you can see here, for example, that there's growth of 7%, 4%, and 1% across here for Python. We see growth in HTML and CSS in UK and Asia Pac, but a slight decline in the US. Where is it going to continue to grow in the US? And we see the stronger growth coming from, for example, C# in this audience, or C++, C++, or Rust, for example. And so we do see some changes over time for these organizations in terms of what they think they're going to be using tomorrow. Again, your ability to say what you do today versus what you do tomorrow is I wish you all had a great crystal ball, but at least from their perspective and their perceptions, this is what they think the environment's going to look like for them. Now, what are the workloads in place today versus tomorrow? And no surprise, web servers, business process apps, databases, and just slight growth, because 88%, most organizations, of course, are running web servers somewhere, or running business apps, or running databases. Slight growth around databases. Analytics, we would expect this to continue to grow. I think it's really interesting to see it at 77% already, but we should expect this to grow across the board. The 600 companies are reporting a growth to about 82%. AI and ML, we know that's where a lot of the focus is, and we can see this big jump from 59% today of these organizations saying they have those workloads to thinking 71% in the future. Data caching and HPC, we know there's going to be a lot going on. We're going to try and push more things to the edge, which means we're probably going to do a lot more processing at the core, and HPC and data caching has a really strong role in a lot of that. In terms of today by region now, do we see differences? Interestingly, we do, right? So web servers in the US, much stronger, if you will, than say the UK, but not necessarily so compared to Asia Pac. Business process apps, all very strong, very high. A little bit of difference between what the Asia Pac companies were reporting relative to, say, the UK. You can see that B, I'll do that column B. Database is very strong, and analytics much stronger in the US and the UK than the Asia Pac region right now. AI ML stronger in the US, as is data caching, as is HPC, slightly more so than Asia Pac, right? So some interesting reads on the regionality of these workloads. Now, same thing, looking at tomorrow, what they think. And we've got down at the bottom where we're going to see that growth. And you can see how AI ML, for example, is growing strongly in all the regions, but more so in the US, up 15 points, they think. Analytics growing even more so in the US. Data caching and high performance growing in the US. So the US is definitely, as a region, very tech forward. Obviously, we have the big tech sectors tech areas in the country, influencing all of our businesses and organizations. And it's super competitive here with respect to technology. We as a research organization, we dedicate ourselves to the technology sector, but what we see is this incredible nexus of technology and other industries. And a lot of companies in different industries in tech are becoming technology companies. And this kind of reflects that attitude, that view that there's going to be a lot more of these types of workloads being run in the US. Now, where are they doing the development? How's it getting done? You know, we require them to have an internal app development team when we recruited these folks to talk to. And so you can see a good portion, about a third of them developing in-house. But when we look at developed by third party, partner, off the shelf commercial or off the shelf plus custom ads, you can see there's a lot more of these other applications that they have in their environments and a lot of add-ons to some of these off the shelf applications. So there are a lot of there's a lot of code, there's a lot of application coming from outside the organization, in addition to that roughly third within the organization. So some complexity, some real complexity as we think about how do we modernize, how do we make the decisions about what to do with some of these applications that are running some of our critical infrastructure. Cloud enabled versus cloud native, what does that look like? What percentage is legacy? When we look at today versus the next 2 years, right? And 2 years from now, we see about a third of the applications being legacy, and we still see, 23% in 2 years. Legacy is not going anywhere. Legacy is difficult to modernize 100% of, and we all know that, right? There are just some apps that will never be modernized. Some of them can be cloud enabled. We can build a proprietary, so we can build a cloud front end for a proprietary database transaction server on the back end, right? That stays legacy, but we can still sort of modernize the front of that so we can cloud enable it. But we still have that legacy infrastructure. We still have that legacy database. So there's no question that we're going to see a continued presence of these legacy apps and the infrastructure that supports them. But we're also seeing a lot of movement, obviously, towards cloud enabled and cloud native. As I said earlier, what we hear pretty consistently is anything new is obviously going to be cloud native, no question about it, right? So we'll see that over time, that trend towards a larger percentage of cloud native. But boy, we still have a lot of legacy apps out there. And it depends what we talk about legacy, right? Is legacy 10 years old? Is it 15 years old? I mean, everyone likes to joke about COBOL. But there's a lot of apps that were written, in the 90s and early 2000s, the aughts, that they still think as legacy applications. And so it really depends upon how we define legacy, but clearly it's not going anywhere fast, even though we'd all potentially like it to. But some interesting complexities and views on how they're going about and what they think that percentage, that ratio of legacy to cloud native looks like 2 years from now. Private versus public, and are we all clear on really what that means? And so we asked the question about, what do we see as that shift? Is it going to stay public? Is it going to go private on-prem? Is it going to go private off-prem? And again, I think in there is that question mark around, are we all clear on what the definitions are? We do our best when we do this kind of survey work to make sure we provide clear definitions. But what we're seeing very interestingly is if you look at today, public cloud, this is the total view in that gold column. It's going from 98% to 88%, meaning organizations are really rethinking their presence on public infrastructure versus private on public, meaning I've got a single tenant, secure environment, which I consider private cloud on-prem versus private cloud off-prem, right? And so I think we're seeing some shifting in perspective on, do we keep it on cloud, public cloud, or do we go private off or private on? And you can see some differences by region, right? So if we look, for example, at private cloud off-premise, meaning I'm still comfortable deploying on AWS or Google or Azure for that matter, I'm seeing a growth today to 2 years from now from 43% to 55% in total. But we see that growth in the US. We see that growth in the UK from 49 to 63 and from 38 to 58 in Asia Pac. I think there's a greater sensitivity because of all the data, the GDPR, the data privacy things going on in Europe and other places. It's impacting those regions, I think, more so in their thinking than the US, where they're needing to be more secure. So we are going to see this interesting shift, I think, to more private infrastructure, private cloud than we are, say, 100% public. And I mean, look at the Asia Pac region saying 100% public cloud today to 74% in 2 years. So some very interesting shifts and thinking around where we deploy and how we build our applications. Now, what is that strategy in terms of what we do with legacy? Are we going to retire? Are we going to retain, rehost, replatform, refactor, repurchase? We have all these different options. And really predominantly what we're seeing is it's about repurchasing, which is, look, if I can move from, let's say, a perpetual license to a subscription model where I'm now in the cloud, it's a SaaS application, and I can actually get updates more continuously. Yes, I'm going to repurchase. So I'm going to stick with my vendor and I'm going to go with their product as a cloud delivered service, right? A software as a service, right? Or I'm just going to switch, right? Because I maybe was already somewhat in the cloud and I want to just move to a completely cloud-based solution. So repurchase is a real part of the strategy. And you can see it's an even stronger piece for the Asia Pac region, where they're actually higher than the UK and the US in terms of using repurchase as a method for how they move forward in terms of modernization. And then you can kind of work your way up and see how, replatform, refactor, repurchase seems to be a very strong piece of this, as well as just simply rehosting. Look, we're going to lift and shift. We're going to move it. It's the easiest way for us to get this done. And we're going to no longer have to take care of that infrastructure. And we get some of the scalability that we would like to see from cloud, right? And then clearly there's going to be cases where they say, yeah, just don't touch it. Put it in a corner, leave it alone. It's working fine. We get what we need from it. Let's just leave it as is, or let's sunset it. It's time for that thing to be done. And you can see there's more of that sort of perspective from the US compared to the two other regions, right? A lot more legacy applications that are really old where they're just saying, yeah, as soon as that server dies, we're done with it. In terms of what that shift from legacy to, say, cloud native is going to look like and how fast it's going to happen, the companies overall are planning for more than half of those custom applications to be modernized in the next year. So that's an aggressive shift, change, if you will, right? So within 1 year, they want more than half of their custom apps to be modernized. So that's very interesting. And you can see then, of course, those percentages that are going to take 1 to 2 years, probably the more difficult apps to shift to a modern architecture. And some, they just probably lower priorities, going to probably take 2 years or long. So there's a long timeline for this app modernization to take place. And I think we have to think about that when we look at the strategies and the things that we need to do to maybe move some of these more quickly. Where are they focused? What's the priority in terms of modernization? And when we look across the board, it is more about those core back-end business applications, then customer-facing applications, then data and analytics and BI apps, and then that employee productivity piece, which is stronger in the US. The US is all about productivity. Good old America, it's all about productivity. Whereas we can see, for example, a stronger sort of lean towards the BI and data analytics in the UK and Asia Pac relative to the US. I think this is really just about the age of our infrastructure, the age of our application estates across all our companies in the US. We just have a lot more legacy applications that are focused on ERP, those core backend business applications, which is probably why we see some of those differences in terms of where the focus is. Who's going to help us? How can we do this ourselves? We're going to reach out. And what we find is, even though the organizations may have some internal resources, some dev teams, it's that if we're a 100,000 person company, yeah, we've got an army of developers that can help us do this, but we're not. We're a 10,000 person company. We're a 2,000 person company, right? We don't have that much of a development team or that large of a development team. So we're going to turn to partners. And that's either by giving them complete control and running of that modernization. So it's handled completely by the external partner. And you can see that's about 30% across the board of the regions we looked at, or it's going to be led by those external partners. But when you put it together, almost 70% in total say it's going to be using a third party, a partner to help. So partners are going to play a very big role when we look at that growth, that goal of modernizing as much as we are trying to modernize in the next 1 to 2 years. In terms of architectural approaches, what are we going to do? Are we going to just kind of stick to a mix of these things or focus on microservices, for example? we can see here that really that hybrid sort of thinking is really the top model, meaning probably a lot of them still haven't made decisions about this. So when you look at it, you think, we're probably going to just be hybrid because we're not exactly sure. Plus, all of this is shifting very quickly as we think about technology going from containers to service mesh to some of the other new ways that we're thinking about building and deploying applications. So microservices still really, at the top there, one of the considerations. Serverless or factor as a service, those are important, and they're going to be part of the equation. And it looks like about a third of the organization think that that's going to be one of the methods for how we actually go about modernizing the applications in terms of an architectural approach. All right, we did a little deep dive on Java EE, just trying to get a sense of where is that headed, what's going to happen there. So about 90% of the people that we interviewed said we're going to modernize our custom Java EE apps in the next 2 years. Well, what are they going to do? Are they going to completely rewrite them? Are they going to just rehost them? Nope. What we're going to see is about a even split between rehosting, replatforming, and refactoring. I think there's just multiple paths when we think about the number of the applications that are out there. There's just no consensus here about which is the best path to go. It's really application and business dependent on how we approach modernizing this set of applications. All right, some quick details on some of these items, last few items here. Look, when we looked at what are the things built into the applications, we're talking about custom applications. What are the elements that make some of these applications complex or modernize them more complex? Well, integration, number one, of course. Anytime we have integration, it makes it more complex in terms of how we approach modernization. Data streaming, AI and ML services, these have all been now built into some of our applications. So how do we modernize and make some of these shifts with some of these things built into these? If we're going to modernize, when we have something like integration, so of those who said integration is the most common element included in the applications, how do they plan to go about this to move to the cloud? So the plan to repurchase or replace with cloud services in the next 2 years, it's really about integration, data streaming in some cases, but you can see authentication, authorization being one of the more common elements that they plan to either replace or repurchase with cloud services, right? So where it's really a question mark of where we think we can apply these things. So yeah, we can certainly replace or repurchase integration functionality with cloud services, or we can do authentication and authorization that way, which is the biggest one. We know there's a lot of really good open source code and things that we're doing around authentication, authorization, et cetera, event management, API management, et cetera. So this is really that perspective of here's where we have the most common things in our applications that we need to think about, and whether we can actually replace those or repurchase those elements with cloud services. Again, it's all perspective as we move forward. Now let's look at that by region. And you can see again, compared to other regions, the US is more likely to have integration in their custom applications and less likely to have authentication. I thought that was very interesting. Again, it's all perception when we ask these questions, because they're looking at their state and saying, yeah, well, of course we have authentication, but really what we're most concerned about when we think about our custom apps, it's that integration that we have. So some very interesting differences by region in terms of what they believe their apps have the most in terms of these common elements across those applications. And then in terms of looking at that by region, these are the companies in the US here are much more likely to say they're going to replace integration with cloud services, replace or repurchase. In the US, again, data streaming is going to be more likely to be done with cloud services. Whereas outside the US, they're going to replace authentication, authorization more so with those cloud services. This is a perspective on how we think we're going to modernize this element of our applications. And those little asterisks there just means the number of people that actually answer that question and then could follow up with the question of how I'm going to actually replace or purchase the cloud services, or where I'm going to do that. It's a very small base size. So we want to just kind of put caution to some of these differences that we see here. But for sure, since the sample size in the US is so large, we certainly can really lean in and believe that these two areas on integration and AI are where the US is really going to focus these cloud services. And that's it. That's all I've got.
Awesome. Thank you, Jay. Thank you for going through all that. And sorry to everyone. Apparently I was on mute at the beginning. But if you have any questions, please put it in the Q&A. And while we have Jay here, he can definitely go over any of the questions that you have. I'll just look through this right now. All right, so we don't have anything. Jay, was there anything that stuck out to you at all these findings?
I think the thing that we always find interesting is those regional differences. In the early days when we were doing research, say in the US, and then we'd go to the UK, and then we'd go to, say, Australia or Asia Pac region, we saw this very interesting sort of 6 month to a year difference in where the US was on that journey relative to those regions. And we also recognized that those other regions got to leapfrog the US in some cases because we had some of that legacy infrastructure that didn't exist. And wireless was one of the best examples of how some of these other regions just blew past the US in terms of their wireless infrastructure. And so I think that's where we really want to kind of look at those differences and try to understand those, because that will have implications in terms of where we, if we're a product company and we're wanting to sell new tools into those regions, how do we do our messaging? Because they're going to be in a potentially different place than they are in the US. So what matters in Asia Pac is clearly different in some cases. They're more focused on customer satisfaction right now than we are in the US. Again, it's not that the US isn't, it's just that we're further along that path than, say, they are in Australia and ANZ, right?
Yeah, true. No, that's a really good point. Well, everyone, Jay, there is no questions. Everyone's saying great job, and great job with the presentation and also the content. I will put the link to the Konveyor Slack in the chat as well. So that way, if you guys have any questions, you can put it there and somebody can try to help with that. Let's see. Marcus Nagel has a comment.
Yeah, I saw his comment. Yeah, Marcus, I think you're right? Especially if we think about the US. I think about the age of some of these applications, right? Non-Java being so widely used, right? And I think this is your mileage may vary. We're asking developers and architects, and to some extent they're answering on behalf of their organization, but also from their own personal perspective. And they may be using those tools, the more modern tools, as much as they can. And so it's really a question of what they're doing, right? You could cut this so many ways, and we could have asked 100 questions, say, oh, for each of the applications that you're developing, what tools are you using, right? But you're absolutely correct. It's very interesting to see and good to see, I guess, that we're finally breaking away from Java, maybe.
Thank you, Marcus, for that. Well, everyone, that's it. So thank you for attending, and we'll catch you next time. Thank you, Jay.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers.